All right, in this video, I'm going to talk about dissociative disorders and schizophrenia. In a dissociative disorder, the person dissociates or stops associating with a specific part of their memory. Um, and so all of a sudden, you're unaware of some aspect of your history, some aspect of your identity, um, uh, and you're unable to recall them except under very specific circumstances. I'm going to talk about three types of dissociations. The first one is the most basic one, is associative amnesia. And in dissociative amnesia, the only real symptom is the amnesia, the memory loss. And so this individual just doesn't remember some traumatic event. Um, Maybe they don't remember being abused as a child, or sometimes it's more acute, more obvious, and the individual, maybe you saw someone get shot in front of you, and now you just don't remember that. You don't remember those 5 to 10 hours while you saw it and called the cops and got taken to the uh, police department. You just don't remember that at all. Anybody can ask you anything about that, and you're going to say, I don't remember that. And if they ask you, hey, what about your friend that died? And they're like, my friend didn't die. I don't remember that at all. You just don't have a memory of that. Sometimes that just goes away and you reintegrate that memory back into your system. But sometimes you don't. Uh, Also, this isn't amnesia related to brain damage. This is only the trauma, the emotional trauma is what creates the amnesia here. Now, this can also be global, where you kind of don't know who you are, you don't know uh, where you come from, or maybe even your name, but that's less likely. Usually, if it starts to get global, it becomes something else. So here's an example. Margie and her brother were recently victims of a robbery. Margie was not injured, but her brother was killed when he resisted the robbers. Margie was unable to recall any details of the time of the accident until 4 days later. So that would be a type of dissociative amnesia where, in the case of Margie, for a short time, she had no memory of what had actually happened. Uh, Now, a dissociative fugue is a little different. In a dissociative fugue, there is the loss of memory. The loss of memory tends to be global, that is, you forget almost entirely who you are. But there's also this fugue part, and a fugue is like an escape. It is a running away from something. And so, usually in a dissociative fugue, what happens is that this person leaves. They go for a walk, they go for a drive, and then they just keep on going. And by the time that they stop, they don't know who they are anymore. They don't know their name, they don't know where they come from, blah, blah. If this person has, let's say, a wallet on them, then eventually somebody can get them back to their home. But if they don't, they might keep on going for a long time, and they'll have to take a new name. Somebody will say, hey, I'm going to call you Jack now. And they go, all right, I guess I'm Jack now. And they might take some small jobs here and there to make money. Now, this person basically has no recollection of their former life. It's not always so severe. Maybe you got lost for a week or two. And during that week or two, people asked you who you were, but you didn't remember and you didn't know how to get back to your home. When you get back to your home, whether it was a week or a few days or it was a year, eventually your new identity, Jack, or the person that was walking around aimlessly for 2 weeks, they go away. You don't remember what happened during those 2 weeks. You don't remember what happened when you were Jack. And if somebody knew you or met you during that time and they said, hey, I saw you, I met you here or there, you would say, I don't remember that. Because now you've regained your old identity, but you forgot anything that happened during the fugue state. Here's an example. Jay, a high school physics teacher in New York City, disappeared 3 days after his wife unexpectedly left him for another man. 6 months later, he was discovered tending a bar in Miami Beach, calling himself Martin. He claimed to have no recollection of his past life and insisted that he had never been married. Now, in a dissociative fugue, usually it's not trauma from childhood or something like that that's happening. It's usually a lot of stressors that are going on in your life. Losing your family, losing your job is usually something quite severe, though, or a lot of severe things, not just one or two things. And Jay, or I should say, while Martin is Martin, or while he's in Miami Beach, he has no memory of anything Jay would have done. And if he comes back to his life as a high school physics teacher and becomes Jay again, Jay will not remember anything that he did while he was Martin. And if Martin met someone in Miami Beach and they see him as Jay in New York, they're going to say, "Hey, you're Martin. I met you in Miami Beach." And Jay's going to say, "Sorry, wrong guy. I don't remember that." Okay. Now, if the dissociative fugue sounds a little familiar, um, you're probably thinking of something called a dissociative identity disorder, which is actually a different disorder. Sometimes we call it a multiple personality disorder. So this isn't like a dissociative fugue, because in a dissociative fugue, it's usually stressors that are happening now that create a dissociative fugue, trauma that is happening now. Where in a dissociative identity disorder, it's something that happened before, usually in childhood. Um, again, abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse to the point usually of torture. And this individual dissociates from those memories. They try to not have a connection to them. You could imagine someone being abused physically or sexually in childhood, and they're kind of spacing out so that they don't have to remember that. And later that day, they don't remember it. They've dissociated from that memory. But if that happens kind of over and over and over again, there is this feeling that those memories kind of coalesce into their own identity. And so um, now you might be losing time. Let's say you're, I don't know, 20, and you're randomly losing time. And that basically means that maybe you're in class and you fell asleep in the middle of class. And when you woke up, you weren't in class. You were in a bar in another state, let's say in Georgia, and you don't remember how you got there, right? That's what losing time is. Essentially, um, you kind of feel like you fell asleep or you were doing one thing and then you lost some time and you woke up somewhere else. And so you go to a therapist or a doctor because you've been losing time. And in the middle of a therapy session, you kind of switch your identities. And so there you are Jennifer, and in the middle of your therapy session, you get super aggressive and maybe you start kind of yelling at the therapist, "Who are you and why am I here?" And you become super aggressive, maybe throw things and become violent. And you say, when the therapist says, "Jennifer, sit down," you're like, "I'm not Jennifer, I'm Michael." And you basically say that you're somebody else. Or maybe you switch and you say that you're a little girl and you start to cry and you don't know where you are, and you say that your name is Mary. Um, those tend to be the two personalities that are almost always present. A type of aggressive protector personality, and usually a victim, little kid personality or identity, I should say. There's a lot of movies like this. The Three Faces of Eve is an old one, where you see sort of people switching between identities. Here's an example. um, Norma has frequent memory gaps and cannot account for her whereabouts during certain periods of time. While being interviewed by a clinical psychologist, she began speaking in a childlike voice. She claimed that her name was Donna and that she was only 6 years old. Moments later, she seemed to revert to her adult voice and had no recollection of speaking in a childlike voice or claiming that her name was Donna. Let me make this point. In dissociative identity disorders, just like the other dissociative disorders, you have no memory of the other identities or the memories that you have dissociated from. And so Donna doesn't remember who Norma is, and Norma will not remember who Donna is. They have no memories of each other. And so what one identity does is completely secret from what the other identity does. And sometimes in movies, they'll suggest that the identities kind of talk to one another, but that's not very common, if it at all happens. Um, the patterns usually start prior to around age 10. Most people with this disorder tend to be women, and most report or recall memories of torture, sexual abuse as children. And of course, often they also have symptoms of PTSD, which makes perfect sense if they dealt with sexual and physical abuse as children. Split is a great movie with this dissociative identity disorder, but they make a lot of mistakes. The actor does a great job of uh, describing or showing multiple identities, but the movie itself has some major flaws. Number one, even if they have a lot of identities and one of the identities keeps tracks of the other ones, it is very rare for all of the identities to have like an internal monologue where like they kind of talk to each other inside of the mind. That just doesn't really happen. And of course, having dissociative identity disorder does not give you like superpowers or something like that. But what's great about this movie is that the actor does a great job of shifting identities. As I mentioned, we believe that the causes here are usually severe sexual or physical abuse in childhood. Um, uh, but not everyone who has severe sexual abuse or physical abuse, not all of them develop dissociative identity disorder. So, why do some people develop it and other people don't? Well, um, it could be that there is a predisposition toward dissociation. We also know that people with DID are actually easier to hypnotize than other people. And so it might be that that is a cause of it, that uh, some people are just easier to influence. And so when you put those things together, being more easy to influence and having a lot of trauma, then let's say watching a movie about dissociative identity disorder might cause you to turn on those symptoms when before that you didn't really have those symptoms. Um, and so we find that before around the 1960s, maybe there were 2 cases per decade of dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorders at the time. But in the 80s alone, there were 20,000 cases reported. How could that have happened? Well, it could be a lot of things. It could be something simple like, hey, in the 1930s, maybe you had, excuse me, multiple personality disorder, and um, one day you started calling yourself Jack, and then you left your town, and nobody heard from you again. And so of course, you weren't going to get diagnosed. You just left. Um, so maybe it was stuff like that. But we also know that something in the 1980s happened, which was it was one of those first movies about dissociative identity disorder, and maybe that is what triggered a lot of people watched that, and people who had that predisposition kind of turned on those symptoms. We also know that, let's say, in any given city here in Kissimmee, uh, one therapist might end up diagnosing 10 people over their career with dissociative identity disorder. And a therapist, across town diagnosed no one, zero people with dissociative identity disorder. Well, that doesn't really make sense statistically. Statistically, in one town, if one therapist is seeing 10 people with this disorder, there is a chance, or there should be statistically, that the other therapist should also be seeing an approximate uh, uh, 10 uh, people with that disorder. But that's not happening. So some people suggest that maybe it's something that the therapist is doing, maybe something the therapist is suggesting, not on purpose, but by mistake. The therapist kind of suggests certain things, and that triggers the patient to develop these symptoms. Now, before you start thinking that um, people with dissociative identity disorder are maybe faking or something like that, let me make this point. You can't fake certain symptoms of dissociative identity disorder. So let me give you an example of one. If I take a great actor and I put this actor in an EEG machine to um, read their brain waves, the level of activation in the different parts of the brain, and I tell them to act like a woman or like a man or like a specific President Obama, or like a specific artist, Taylor Swift, and they're great. They're a great actor and they can do a great job. When I look at their EEG readings, their brain doesn't change. It still looks like the same person is under the EEG machine. That is, their brain waves, their level of activation doesn't change. But if you have someone with um, dissociative identity disorder, when their identity switches, their EEG readings also switch. And so it looks as if though you have a new person under the machine when it's clearly still the same person physically. But essentially, their brain has switched levels of activation. Their brain is acting differently when they're one identity versus when they're a different identity. And so there are certain symptoms that could not be, they could not be faked. Um, and so some people eat, whether it is suggested or it is just complete, maybe biological, or it is created by the trauma. Regardless of why this is happening, it's happening, and there are ways to verify it. All right, let me talk about a different disorder. This is the last disorder I'm going to talk about, which is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia literally means split mind, and uh, unlike a dissociative disorder, in a dissociative disorder, you're splitting or you're breaking away from a memory or some memories that you have. But in schizophrenia, you are splitting from reality. You are breaking from reality. That is, you no longer experience reality the way the rest of us do, right? If you have schizophrenia. Um, there are men and women uh, get schizophrenia at similar rates, but the onset is different, where men tend to have an onset that is much earlier in their early adulthood, and women tend to have an onset that is later, usually in middle adulthood. Um, this means that for some women, they have a normal life. And then maybe at around 40, they start hearing voices or seeing things that are not there. Um, Again, this is just averages. Are there women who have their onset at 18? Yes. Are there men who have onset much later in life? Yes. But this is on average. We tend to have onset that are earlier for men and later for women. The woman that is in that video that I have a link there to if you want to go watch it, she talks about her schizophrenia, some of the difficult times that she has, and she is part of a movement that um, uh, basically suggests that people with schizophrenia don't always need medication. I I think her story is great, and I certainly suggest that you watch it. It's not really tenable to suggest that all people with schizophrenia can um, control their delusions or hallucinations to the point where they don't need medication. Some people absolutely, or actually probably most people, will absolutely need medication to control their symptoms. And there are some people who, even with medication, their symptoms are not completely under control, and they can have quite difficult lives. If you haven't watched The Beautiful Mind, it's great, and it focuses on schizophrenia. So I don't want to give too much away because it kind of ruins the plot line. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the different types of symptoms. So, some symptoms are what we call positive symptoms. And a positive symptoms are things that are extra. That is, if you have schizophrenia, you experience more things than the rest of us do. So, the classic um, symptom for schizophrenia is hallucinations. Somebody with schizophrenia might hallucinate. They might see things that are not there or hear things that are not there. And so this person might see extra people or extra animals that are not there. They might hear voices that are not there. It is perhaps because of this reason why certain religions and cultures suggest that people with schizophrenia are actually closer to the spiritual world. There are some Native American cultures that feel that schizophrenics are actually closer to the spiritual world because they see things that the rest of us don't see. It's important to point out that sometimes the hallucinations can be positive, and especially early on, the hallucinations are not always negative. Sometimes people will hear a disembodied voice narrate their life, and so they might say, "Josh was opening the door to his car," and they just hear that as if though they heard it out loud, but they hear it in their mind. Um, but the longer they have schizophrenia and the more the schizophrenia interferes in their life, well, negative emotions start being part of the hallucinations. And then the voices and the visual hallucinations start getting sometimes aggressive, and they might say things that are scary, or you might see things that are scary. Um, and that can be very traumatic. Along with hallucinations, a lot of people with schizophrenia often have delusions. And a delusion is when you believe something is real that is clearly not. People sometimes have a hard time between hallucinations and delusions. In a hallucination, you're seeing or hearing something that is not there. The rest of us don't see it, but you see it. The rest of us don't hear it, but you hear it. In a delusion, there is no hallucination. You just believe things that the rest of us think are clearly not true. So you might have a delusion of grandeur. Maybe you believe that you're secretly the president, or that you're secretly some religious figure, Moses, or Jesus, or Mary, or something like that. Well, the rest of us clearly know you're not the president, clearly know that you are not this religious figure, but you believe that you are. Um, you might have delusions of persecution. Delusion of persecution usually uh, is someone you think that somebody's following you. You think someone is sort of coming after you. Uh, you might think the government is after you, or the demons are after you, or the aliens are after you. Some delusions are quite normal. And so if you don't know what's happening, you might get confused and be like, oh, that kind of sounds normal. You might say that somebody might tell you that they went to a government office and the person got angry with them and maybe they're trying to take away their house, something like that. Well, that's plausible. Um, if you go digging, you might realize that nothing like that actually happened, but the story by itself is at least plausible. And so we might consider that sort of a normal or non-magical delusion. But some delusions we call magical. And this is somebody who tells you that the aliens are after them or the demons are after them or something that is clearly not part of reality. Some people have delusions of being controlled, where they feel that um, if they don't do it, then something bad will happen, and they might say to you that the aliens force them to do this or that. The aliens might be sending signals into my brain and they control my body, or they might tell you that the voices told them if you don't do this, then we're going to hurt your family, for example. And so they felt compelled to do it because the voices were so scary. These are delusions of being controlled. And obviously, people might have both hallucinations and delusions. For famously, Son of Sam, who was a serial killer, um, said that the reason he killed all those kids was because the devil was speaking to him through his neighbor's dog. And so he heard the neighbor's dog giving him commands. That is clearly a hallucination, seeing and hearing the dog talk, and a delusion. He believed that the devil was telling him to do it. Um, so there are combinations there. Point of order there. Um, you'll often hear things like that, that somebody who is schizophrenic sometimes does something that is violent. Not too long ago, there was a gentleman who um, shot up a military installation uh, because, well, he just started shooting up. We later found out that he had called the cops and told them that he could hear the president talking through his lamp or through the microwave, something like that. And of course, the cops went to check the house and they couldn't hear anything. And so they left. This gentleman had access to a lot of weapons. He ended up hurting himself and others. But that is very rare. In fact, people with schizophrenia are much more likely to be abused by others than they are to actually commit crimes or to hurt others. But that's usually what we hear about on the news, is the ones that end up committing an atrocity, unfortunately. Another positive symptom is what we call disorganized speech. And this might include over inclusion, where they jump from idea to idea without any logical association. Um, they might say, it rained today because the purple fairies drank all the dust from the shelves. And that clearly doesn't make any sense. The sentence structure is correct, by the way. All the nouns are where the nouns are supposed to be, and all the verbs are where the verbs are supposed to be. The sentence structure is still there. So they're not saying blue, yellow, purple, house, plant, dishes, microwave. They're not just saying just random words. Their sentences are correct, but there is no logic to what they're saying. Sometimes they might do what we call a paralogic. Well, if you're not really paying attention, this person sounds like they're just talking. But if you're trying to make sense of what they're saying, it doesn't go anywhere. And so this person might tell you, they're uh, people in Syria are having to escape. There's a war going on there, and the reason for that is, that uh, shoes are all $50 or higher now, and you can't get a good pair of shoes for less than 50 or $100. And if you're not paying attention to them, you might just think that this person is just talking about two separate things. But if you're trying to keep track of the conversation, you go, wait a second, what does shoes have to do with Syria? It doesn't actually make any logical sense. So this is what we would call disorganized speech. Some people have disorganized behavior. This might include, let's say, somebody who puts on all of their best clothes. They did their hair, they put on their best dress, some nylon stockings, they did their makeup, they look beautiful. And they walk into the shower and they take a shower with all of it on, right? Well, their behavior doesn't match reality. That is a disorganized behavior. Somebody might put on all their sweaters, like if it's freezing outside, all their sweaters, they're put on a bunch of layers, and then they walk out into 90, 100-degree weather. Or the opposite, they might put on their bikini and walk out into freezing weather. Sometimes their affect is disorganized, is inappropriate. So they might start laughing in a funeral. Now, you might be at a funeral and in a moment of calm, you're remembering something the deceased did, and it's a nice memory, and you might laugh. That's different, right? This person is laughing almost instead of crying. So they might be right there at the casket, and instead of crying, they just start laughing. Or the opposite, you tell them a good joke, and they start to cry instead of laugh, right? Their affect, that is their emotion, doesn't match what is happening in the real world. Now, some people have what we would call negative symptoms. Okay. Now, negative symptoms are the absence of normal behavior. So these individuals are reacting less, or they have less things in their reality than you and I have in ours. And so this individual might um, you might tell them a joke and they don't laugh at all. You might throw a ball at them and the ball hits them right in the face, but they don't react. You can scream at them and they don't react. So this is an absence of normal affect or normal behavior, normal cognition. Um, you see this in people who are catatonic. Catatonia, this is another difference in the DSM-5. Catatonia used to be part of schizophrenia, but now catatonia is its own um, diagnosable disorder. And if you have a lot of negative symptoms and no positive symptoms at all, then you might just be catatonic or diagnosed as catatonic and not as schizophrenic. Okay. Um, Another difference here with the DSM-5 is that the DSM-4 and the DSM-4-TR used to categorize schizophrenia as different categories: paranoid type, catatonic type, and disorganized type. But of course, the data didn't really suggest that this made sense. Really, what happened was that there was a lot of overlap. People were being categorized as paranoid, but they had disorganized symptoms, or they were categorized as disorganized and they had paranoid systems. And then, of course, the catatonic type, if they're just catatonic, that doesn't really seem to be a part of schizophrenia. That is its own disorder now. But some people have uh, negative symptoms along with some positive symptoms, let's say paranoid types with some negative symptoms. And so there's a lot of overlap. And so the types are no longer used, the subtypes are no longer used. You're schizophrenic, and then the different symptoms that you are showing. Schizophrenia is one of the most genetic or the most biological of the mental disorders. Not the most, but certainly one of the most. And so we can sort of demonstrate that there is a genetic or heritable uh, uh, aspect to schizophrenia. In the general population, probably about 1% of the population is schizophrenic. If you have a sibling that suffers from schizophrenia, the chances that you too suffer from schizophrenia go up dramatically, about 5%. If you are the child of one parent who is a schizophrenic, then your chances of being schizophrenic go up higher than 10%. If your fraternal twin is a schizophrenic or has schizophrenia, you have a chances of suffering from schizophrenia at close to 20%. And you see there, if both of your parents are schizophrenic, or your identical twin is schizophrenic, you come very close to being at risk of 50%. Now you'll notice that even at the highest, it doesn't really reach 50%. So what we're seeing is a genetic connection here, a correlation. And so it's very clear and obvious, but it's by no means the only thing that is a factor here. Um, there are other factors. So some sociocultural factors, parental communication that is disorganized or hard to follow. Now, if you don't have a predisposition for schizophrenia, then maybe you develop some other disorder, depression, anxiety, some other issue. But if you have a predisposition for schizophrenia, maybe this turns that on. Um, uh, as parents that are highly critical, over-enmeshed families. An over-enmeshed family is families that don't know boundaries. So, for example, if you have a normal, healthy family relationship, usually your parents have a role in your life and they only have that role. Your parents don't try to go clubbing with you. Your parents don't try to act like your siblings. They don't try to act like your cousins. Your auntie doesn't try to act like your parent, right? But if you have an over-enmeshed family, people don't know boundaries. And so people behave outside of their role. And if you're a child, you don't know how to take that. And so you kind of, it kind of affects you emotionally. And if you have a predisposition for schizophrenia, maybe that turns that on. Again, other types of psychologically unhealthy families with a predisposition for schizophrenia might turn on that schizophrenia. Some other factors: a difficult birth, low oxygen, for example, at birth, prenatal viral infection, that is, mom got infected while she was pregnant, being born between um, the months of February to March. This is probably related to viral infection, and it's just a correlation that occurs there. The age of the father, when dad is much older, this also tends to raise the chances that a child might develop schizophrenia in adulthood. Dopamine. We know that when dopamine is too high, it creates hallucinations and delusions. It's one of the ways that we try to control for schizophrenia is we give you drugs that lower dopamine. But we also know that if you are bipolar in your manic state, dopamine, high dopamine, also creates hallucinations and delusions. And so we can control for that. But some of the other symptoms are harder to control for. Brain structure is another factor. One of the things that we know is that enlarged ventricles in the brain are usually associated with schizophrenia. It's probably not the ventricles, right? So it's probably because the ventricles are so much larger, some brain matter in the brain has to be smaller in order to fit the larger ventricles. And people suggest that maybe it's those parts of the brain that are creating the schizophrenia. There are no real early warning signs. So people who develop schizophrenia often have some attention deficit disorder in childhood, but obviously most people with attention deficit in childhood don't develop schizophrenia. And so there is no real early warning sign until the symptoms turn on. Probably the best warning sign is if you are genetically related to someone who is a schizophrenic, or if you lived in a household with someone who was schizophrenic from very early on, that also might raise the chances that you develop schizophrenia in adulthood. But there aren't really a lot of early warning signs there. Okay. All right, guys, that's the last video for chapter 13. It's actually the last video for the class. Um, I will try to make another video or send out an announcement to make sure that everybody is finishing up, because the semester is almost over. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.